Well, it is hard to believe, just 2.5 years after the biggest contraction in the UK economy for 300 years, we're talking about what could be a bigger economic crisis than COVID. Energy prices soaring with war in Ukraine, inflation at levels not seen for 40 years, concerns about poverty and vulnerable people struggling to heat or eat. It's pretty grim, and it will, of course, be the political background for years to come. So what should the next Prime Minister do? Well, Philip Hammond became Chancellor in the economic uncertainty after the Brexit referendum. He joins us now. Thank you very much for being with us.
Pleasure.
I'm very interested to hear your take on what the economic picture actually is and what the next months and potentially years could look like. How bad could it be?
Well, it looks to me that it's very challenging in the short term, but I think that the longer term prognosis is a bit better for the UK. If I were advising the incoming Prime Minister, my advice would be to be very honest with the British people about the challenges we're facing in the short term and how we're going to deal with them. Of course, the government is going to have to provide support to deal with massive energy bills in the short term. But I think the incoming Prime Minister's got to be clear about what the government can do and what it can't do. It can help with the short-term pressures, the bit of this in energy inflation, which is temporary, cyclical, related to the war in Ukraine.
But what we're talking about here is people not being able to afford to heat their homes,
sure.
Right? And pay their food bills.
And the government will, can and should intervene to help with that short-term pressure. But to the extent that some element of the increase in energy costs is going to be structural, long-term, as we seek to become more energy independent in the future, as we seek to decarbonise in the future, government's got to be honest with people that represents a change in our priorities for consumption. And I think this has always been a bit of an issue that we've had about being open and honest with people about what the decarbonisation agenda over the medium and long term.
What does that mean in layman terms? What decarbonisation?
It means that.
Do you mean the green agenda?
The green agenda. It means that energy is going to be more expensive than it was before the current crisis. Not the levels it is now, because those levels are driven to a very significant extent by short-term temporary factors. But we are going to have to face the fact that to decarbonise our economy, to tackle global warming, we are going to have, in the long term, higher energy prices than we were used to having a couple of years ago. And I think the government just needs to be honest and open with people. We also need to be clear that the short-term measures that I'm sure will be announced in the next few days to help people over this winter have got to be paid for somehow. They can't all just be done through borrowing. We're dealing with an inflation crisis. Borrowing adds more stimulus to the economy. That is exactly the opposite of what we should be trying to do to dampen down inflation.
So, by finding a way to pay for it, do you mean spending cuts?
It means reprioritising, and that's what people around the world are doing. They're saying, look, we've got this programme over here.
Does reprioritising mean spending cuts?
It means postponing or delaying things that the government might have wanted to do in the winter of 22-23.
So
because we need to push that money into helping people with energy bills, just as people would do with their own budgets. If a problem comes up, you immediately reprioritise. That's what you do. The government has to do the same. It can't just go out and borrow hundreds of billions of pounds more, because that will only stimulate more inflation.
Are you concerned that is what Liz Truss effectively will be doing?
Well, I would be concerned if that was what the new government decides to do. I don't think it will. I think it will certainly want to do some borrowing, but I hope that it will do some reprioritisation as well, reflecting the fact that inflation is the challenge.
Reflecting the fact that inflation is the challenge, we've also been talking an awful lot about tax cuts. Rishi Sunak, but also clearly Liz Truss, at seeing tax cuts as a priority, something that the IFS has said that could add to the inflation. Would tax cuts add to inflation?
Yes. I mean, tax cuts now, everything else being equal, would deliver an inflationary stimulus. That is not the right thing to do. I think David Davis...
tax cuts aren't the right thing to do right now?
No, I think David Davis said earlier, and I'd agree with him, that we are a party that advocates low taxes. We need the new government to have a very clear set of conservative philosophical principles, including the desire to contain the state, keep taxes as low as possible. But those have to be the long-term guiding principles for our policy agenda. In the short term, we have to be pragmatic, and cutting taxes at a time when we have a huge deficit, £160 billion probably this year of government borrowing, when inflation is the major problem we have to tackle, is simply not the answer. And of course, the other thing is, throughout this decade, the 2020s, we always knew we were going to have exceptional pressure on public services because of the ageing profile of our population. If the government can manage to hold taxes stable, that will be an immense achievement, in my view.
Liz Truss has acknowledged this morning that tax cuts would benefit the wealthier more than those on lower incomes or, of course, those on benefits as well. Does that add to your view that right now is not the time for tax cuts?
Well, it depends how you structure them, but I think there are many reasons why tax cuts in the immediate future will not be the right way to tackle this crisis. I think the government needs to provide targeted support to those most in need around the immediate crisis over energy bills. We don't know what the future is going to be, but there is a good chance that energy inflation will abate during the course of 2023, and we will find that we've got over this immediate crisis.
Mm-hmm. You were also talking about borrowing and the concerns that you have about borrowing. Are you worried that the Conservative reputation for fiscal responsibility, you had the austerity years, of course, with George Osborne. You were someone who I think was described as Eeyore by some of the tabloids in your time. Are you concerned that the Conservative reputation for fiscal responsibility is at stake right now?
Yes, and I'm concerned that the Conservative reputation for competent government is at stake. And I think the new government needs to decide from day one to be honest with the public, to reach out across the Tory party and beyond to show that it will be a government that governs for the whole country, that it's a government that's underpinned by a clear set of principles and values, and those would include sound money, balanced budgets, paying our way in the world, good Tory principles, but that it is also pragmatic and it will deal with the specific problems that we're facing, like the cost of living crisis right now. So a strong set of underpinning values that inform our long-term agenda, but an absolute commitment to pragmatism and competent government, competent management on a day-to-day basis.
Who did you vote for?
I haven't endorsed either candidate publicly, and I'm not going to do so now.
OK. Is there... OK. Reading between the lines, it feels like you may be more on the Rishi Sunak side than the Liz Truss side. Am I overstepping?
Look, I look at the bookies' odds, I look at the polling, and I'm pretty sure we're going to have a Truss government. I've worked very closely with Liz Truss. She was Chief Secretary to the Treasury while I was Chancellor. She was a formidable Chief Secretary. She works very hard. She is very diligent. And I think she can make a very good Prime Minister, but she must do it by being inclusive. She'll send a clear signal as early as Tuesday when she starts to form her cabinet, and it must be a cabinet that reflects the talent across the Conservative Party and sends a message to the country that this will be a government that focuses on delivery, on competence, on honesty, and on applying those values in a pragmatic way.
Nicola Sturgeon, earlier in this programme, said she was no shrinking violet. Would you agree with that description?
Oh, she's a tough cookie, and anyone who's had to deal with Liz Truss as Chief Secretary to the Treasury negotiating their spending settlement will know that very well. I know her as a colleague, as somebody who got things done, and that's a rarer commodity than you might think in government. But you ask her to do something, it would always be done. That's a pretty good credential for being Prime Minister.
We are out of time, but just quickly, there's some speculation that Boris Johnson could mount a comeback. Eddie Lister, Lord Lister, told me earlier on the show that if the ball came loose from the back of the scrum, he wouldn't rule out Boris Johnson picking it up. What do you make of that?
I think this is fantasy. I think Boris has not been a good Prime Minister. I think he's damaged the office of Prime Minister. I think he's damaged the Tory party. And I think Boris will no doubt have a very successful career in other fields in the future. And I think he should move on and put aside any idea of hanging like a sort of malevolent shadow over the next government. He needs to let the new Prime Minister get on with his or her job and make it clear that he's moved on as well.
Do you think that he hasn't done that yet then?
I think he hasn't done it yet.
OK, thank you very much indeed, Philip Hammond.